There comes a point in life when the questions change. It's no longer about success, goals, or achievements. It's about silence, about meaning, about the end. Little by little, we realize that behind our routines, beliefs, and certainties, there's a kind of emptiness, a deep silence we can't ignore. This is where most people turn away, but a few dare to look. This video isn't about comfort. It's not about self-help. It's about what happens when a mature mind stares into the abyss, when existence shows itself without makeup, and the self feels like nothing more than a brief echo in the void. Here, you'll discover 50 forbidden philosophies, ideas that were forgotten, denied, or feared. Thinkers who faced the void and came back with truths most people are too afraid to hear. Are you ready to question everything we call real, certain, or sacred? Then take a deep breath and dive in. Imagine being surrounded by everything that makes up your daily life: work, chores, relationships, goals. Everything seems to be in its place, running as usual. But suddenly, a strange silence settles in. Nothing has changed on the outside, yet something inside you shifts. You look around and realize none of it truly holds you up. It's as if everything that once felt solid has lost its color, its weight, its meaning. Heidegger called this existential anxiety. Unlike fear, which is tied to something specific, like the fear of falling, losing your job, or being rejected, anxiety has no object. It's a state where the entire world feels distant. Everything loses its familiarity. And in that distance, human beings find themselves face to face with nothing. But Heidegger doesn't see nothingness as pure absence or as something negative. For him, nothingness is the silent backdrop on which all being appears. In his words, nothing is not the opposite of being, but its origin. In other words, we can only recognize that something is because on some level, we're aware that it could also not be. This encounter with nothingness isn't just an intellectual idea. It's deeply lived through anxiety. And it's in that moment that we become capable of questioning our own existence. That's when we stop being just another person in the world and start to exist authentically. This idea connects to one of Heidegger's central concepts: being toward death, Sein zum Tode. Human beings are the only ones who understand that they will die. And it's this awareness that sets us apart. Instead of paralyzing us, knowing that death is certain should wake us up. The end isn't a limit to fear, but a source of meaning. It makes life more urgent, more concrete. Anxiety, then, is not weakness. It's an opening. When the world loses its usual meaning, we're thrown into the freedom to create our own path. The routine breaks, and with it, the illusions. What remains is only the void. But it's precisely there that being can finally emerge with clarity. Heidegger invites us not to run from this void, but to live in it. To recognize in nothingness a beginning, a condition for possibility. Because only those who dare to look into the abyss with courage are capable of living with truth. We think we know what truth is. We use the word every day. We say, "This is true. That's false," as if we were pointing to something fixed, solid, and unchanging. But Nietzsche challenges that illusion. For him, truth, the way we use it, is a construction. More than that, it's a useful lie we've forgotten we invented. Nietzsche invites us to be suspicious of language. The words we use to describe the world are not the world itself. They're just symbols. When we say tree, we're not capturing the essence of the tree, but using a stable metaphor, socially created and repeated so often, it feels natural. And it's in that forgetting where the danger lies. When we forget that truth is a metaphor, that our ideas were created, named, and distorted through language, we start treating them as absolute. We confuse the map with the territory. According to Nietzsche, truth isn't something discovered, but something made. Every concept we use is a reduction, a brutal simplification of reality. We turn life's flowing movement into rigid shapes, because we need stability to survive. That's why he says truth is a set of lies that have been useful to us, and over time, we stop seeing them as lies. But this isn't an invitation to careless relativism. Nietzsche isn't saying that everything is false and nothing matters. He's revealing that truth is a matter of perspective, and every perspective is rooted in will, in strength, instinct, and desire. Truth is never neutral. It always serves someone. It always carries intention. Look at history and you'll see it clearly. Moral systems, political doctrines, religious dogmas, all present themselves as truths, yet each was shaped by context, interests, and power struggles. For Nietzsche, living with clarity means living with this awareness. It means not being fooled by frozen truths. It means keeping thought in motion, just like life itself. Truth isn't a light that illuminates the path. It's a shattered mirror, reflecting fragments of reality. And it's up to us to learn how to walk among the shards. What happens when we search for some ultimate meaning in life and find only silence? When we ask why and get no answer at all? It's exactly at this point, between the desire to understand and the absence of meaning, that Kamu locates the absurd. For him, the absurd isn't in the world, nor only in us. It's born from the clash between the two. The human being, with a hunger for reason, faces an indifferent universe that explains nothing, that responds to nothing. This collision between our craving for clarity and the emptiness of reality is the heart of Camus' philosophy. And faced with this void, the inevitable question arises: if life has no meaning, why keep living? Kamu considers this the only truly serious philosophical question, and his answer, surprisingly, is not despair, but revolt. Revolt here doesn't mean blind rage or violence. It means lucid persistence, choosing to keep living despite the absence of meaning, refusing the easy escape of illusions, while still affirming life with all it contains: beauty, pain, chaos, joy, and finitude. For Camus, even breathing is an act of resistance. Every day lived with awareness of the absurd is a cry against the void. He saw this clearly in the myth of Sisyphus. Condemned by the gods to push a boulder up a mountain for all eternity, Sisyphus seems doomed to a useless existence, but Camus flips the story. We must imagine Sisyphus happy, because by accepting his condition without giving in, he affirms his freedom. He becomes greater than his punishment. Camus rejects false hopes, the imposed beliefs that promise meaning where there is none. He prefers the courage of those who stare into the abyss and choose to go on. This is what he calls the absurd life. Not in the sense of being foolish, but in being profoundly human. To live absurdly is to live without appeal, without waiting for salvation, without needing a final reason to exist. In the end, Camus teaches that the greatness of life is not in having answers, but in continuing to ask the questions. And that even without meaning, life can be beautiful, precisely because it is fragile, fleeting, and ours. For Schopenhauer, life isn't a gift to be celebrated with enthusiasm, but a repetitive cycle of need, frustration, and suffering. At the core of existence, he identifies a blind, relentless force, the will. Not rational will, as in Kant, but something deeper and irrational. An impulse that moves everything: bodies, instincts, human desires, the whole of nature. This will is what keeps us alive, but it's also what drags us into suffering. We are constantly desiring food, pleasure, recognition, security. But once we get what we want, the satisfaction doesn't last. Soon a new emptiness appears, a new restlessness, and when there's nothing left to desire, we fall into boredom, a refined form of anguish. That's why Schopenhauer says the essence of life is pain. To desire is to suffer, to achieve is to feel disappointment, and not to desire is to be bored. When humans become aware of this, they see they're trapped in a never-ending wheel of wants that are never truly fulfilled. In this context, nothingness, which most people fear as the ultimate end, appears as a relief. The void that frightens so many becomes, in Schopenhauer's view, the most peaceful possibility of liberation. It's not about destroying the body, but about ending the will to live, silencing that blind impulse that keeps us in constant unrest. The denial of the will is what he found in the great spiritual masters of the East, like Buddha. He also saw it in aesthetics, art, especially music, being one of the few experiences where we can momentarily suspend wanting and simply be. That's why silence, asceticism, contemplation, and detachment appear as paths to wisdom. Unlike modern optimism, which insists on giving meaning to suffering, Schopenhauer invites a melancholic lucidity. To live is to desire, and to desire is to suffer. The only true liberation lies in stepping away from the game entirely. At its core, his thought confronts us with a radical question. What if the greatest mistake wasn't to suffer, but to have been born at all? This provocation, far from encouraging despair, pushes us to reflect. What kind of life is truly worth living? How do we relate to the endless wanting that lives within us? Schopenhauer doesn't offer us comfort, he offers clarity. And sometimes, seeing suffering exactly as it is can be the first step toward no longer being its prisoner. Behind the norms, values, and ideals that guide our actions, there's an unsettling silence, a void. Both Nietzsche and Freud saw that morality doesn't come from some divine ideal or pure reason, but from something far more human and more fragile, the fear of our own inner chaos. For Nietzsche, morality is a historical invention, not a reflection of eternal truths, but a construction designed to contain life's excess. On the genealogy of morality, he explains how humanity's most intense impulses, strength, desire, instinct, will to power, were repressed and redirected. What was once vital force was turned into guilt, discipline, and sacrifice. The morality of the weak prevailed, and with it came the denial of the body, the earth, and spontaneity. We created good and evil not because we discovered some divine code, but because we needed to tame ourselves. Freud, on the other hand, saw morality as the result of instinctual repression. For civilization to exist, desire had to be contained. Sexual desire, aggressive impulses, the libidinal drive. Over generations, this repression built the superego, an internal voice that judges us, punishes us, and forces us to follow certain standards. But this psychic structure comes at a cost. We carry inside us a constant tension between who we are and who we're supposed to be. For Freud, morality is the price of living together, but also an inevitable source of suffering. Both, in their own way, saw morality as a symbolic wall against the abyss of instinct, violence, meaninglessness, and unrestrained will. We create values to pretend there's stability, to hide the terrifying possibility that deep down, there may be no greater meaning at all. Morality, then, becomes a noble mask over a deep despair. But this realization isn't an argument for nihilism. On the contrary, it calls for maturity. Instead of blindly following inherited values, Nietzsche proposes creating new ones, born from strength, lucidity, and tragic joy. Freud, in turn, invites us to be conscious of the conflict so we can bear the weight of being human. In the end, both show us that morality doesn't save us from the abyss, it only hides it. And maybe it's time we learn to face it. For Sartre, the human being is a living paradox. We exist, but we are not fixed. We have no essence, no predetermined being. Unlike a stone, a tree, or an animal, which simply are, the human being is the one who, by existing, must invent themselves. And this condition defines us. We are an unfinished project, a freedom that brings anxiety. Sartre says that consciousness is a nothingness at the heart of being, a void, a hole in the fabric of reality. While objects are what they are, closed, defined, consciousness is what it is not. It denies, It separates. It steps back from the world so it can choose, imagine, and project. When I look at a stone, I see it as an external object. But when I look at myself, I see a flow that never stabilizes. I am not something given. I am what is not yet. I am possibility, choice, continuous invention. This is the root of the radical freedom Sartre describes. We have no essence before existence. There is no destiny, no fixed human nature, no plan given by a creator. We exist, and then we define ourselves, we shape ourselves, we build ourselves. But this freedom comes with a price: anxiety. To be free means to have no excuses. Every choice is an act of creation, and at the same time, it's total responsibility. We don't choose only for ourselves, but also for others, because when we act, we are affirming a model of humanity. That's why Sartre says we are condemned to be free. Condemned because we can't escape it, and free because nothing completely determines us. We are that empty space that must, at every moment, decide what to do with what has been done to us. Consciousness, then, is not a substance. It's a movement. It's negation and surpassing. It's the nothingness that slips into being to transform it. It doesn't fill, it breaks. It doesn't own, it desires. And in desiring, it reveals the drama of human existence. Being forced to create meaning in a world that offers none ready-made. Sartre invites us to inhabit this void with courage, to recognize that the absence of a given meaning is, in fact, the greatest form of dignity, the chance to make ourselves a work in progress. At the heart of Laozi's thought is a paradox. Emptiness is what makes things truly useful. In a world obsessed with filling, collecting, controlling, and occupying every space, Laozi invites us to look at what's missing, what can't be seen, what can't be touched, yet still holds everything together. Imagine a jar. Its outer shape may be beautiful, solid, decorated, but what really makes it useful is what it holds, or rather, what it doesn't hold. The empty space inside is what allows it to serve its purpose. Without that hollow space, there's no water to carry, no use at all. Laozi says, it's emptiness that gives meaning to form. This view is at the core of the Tao, the way. The Tao is not a material force, nor a personal God. It's the invisible flow running through everything. It doesn't impose, dominate, or demand. It acts without forcing. Laozi calls this wu wei, effortless action, acting in harmony with the nature of things. In this teaching, emptiness is not a flaw, but a virtue. The sage, according to Laozi, does not fill himself with certainties. He empties his heart. He becomes receptive, quiet, flexible, like water, which adapts to any shape without losing its essence. Water is strong because it doesn't resist. It carves stone not through brute force, but through persistence. In the same way, emptiness works, subtle yet transformative. Laozi criticizes the constant drive for accumulation, control, and rigidity. He offers the opposite: lightness, openness, detachment. What is full hardens. What is empty remains open and ready. In the world of the Tao, fullness is the illusion of power. Emptiness is wisdom. There's a kind of peace that only comes when we stop trying to control everything, when we accept silence, pause, and space. That's when the Tao can be felt. Not in the excess of words, but in the space between them. Not in force, but in stillness. In the end, Laozi's teaching is simple, yet profound. What sustains us is not what we have, but the space we leave open. The way is in the hollow, and in that emptiness, life flows with truth. The path of Zen is not a search for answers. It's actually a process of unlearning. At the heart of this tradition lies a paradoxical truth. You only find yourself when you empty yourself of yourself. In Zen Buddhism, enlightenment is not an intellectual achievement or a spiritual prize. It's the awakening that happens when you drop every fixed idea of identity, control, and separation. The self, that solid center we cling to, is seen as an illusion. There is no me that is separate from the world, fixed and independent. What exists are thoughts, sensations, memories, and desires that appear and disappear, like clouds in the sky. Suffering begins when we believe those clouds are permanent, or worse, that they are who we are. Zen invites us to look directly at this illusion and release it. Through meditation, silence, and full attention to the present moment, we gradually loosen the rigidity of the ego. True wisdom lies in this emptying, not because emptiness is the end, but because it reveals the real nature of all things, impermanent, interconnected, and without their own fixed essence. In this emptiness, duality also dissolves, self and other, good and evil, sacred and profane. Zen points to a reality where these separations make no sense. Everything is in everything, and when you no longer see yourself as separate, the entire world becomes part of you, and you, part of it. Enlightenment is not some unreachable mystical state. It happens the moment you are completely present, washing a bowl, listening to the sound of rain, feeling your breath. It's the radical simplicity of being without trying to be. That's why Zen masters speak in surprising metaphors, unexpected laughter, and even silence. Because the emptiness of words often says more than an excess of them. Contrary to what many think, this emptiness is not a denial of life. It's its deepest affirmation. When the ego falls away, what remains is clarity, compassion, and the freedom to live without hiding behind names and labels. In Zen, becoming empty is not losing yourself. It's, for the first time, truly waking up. For Kant, philosophy is not a leap into the dark. It's an attempt to map the limits of human reason. He doesn't want to answer what lies beyond experience, but to ask, how far can we actually know? Within this horizon, nothingness is not something to be discovered. It's something we can only think of as a limit. According to Kant, everything we know passes through two fundamental structures of the mind: space and time. These are like lenses through which we perceive the world. On top of that, we have the categories of understanding, like causality, unity, and substance, which organize what we perceive. In other words, we don't know things in themselves, but only as they appear to us. That's why Kant says that nothingness, or absolute emptiness, cannot be known. We cannot intuit it, because there is no possible experience of what is not. Everything we know is framed within time and space. But nothingness, by definition, exists outside these conditions. It is therefore what Kant calls an idea limit, a concept that marks the boundary of possible thought, but does not correspond to any object of experience. To think of nothingness as the total absence of being is to cross the boundary of legitimate knowledge. We can talk about nothingness, but we cannot know anything about it. It is like a shadow outlining everything we know, without ever allowing itself to be grasped. This Kantian rigor has a profound impact. It avoids the metaphysical delusion of trying to explain what lies beyond reason. Instead of speculating about what exists outside reality, Kant invites us to reflect on the conditions of thought itself. In this sense, nothingness plays an essential philosophical role. It shows us how far reason can go, and where it must stop. There is no intuition of the void because the void does not appear. It cannot be represented, nor felt as something present. It is a limit concept, a marker of our finiteness. Kant does not invite us to fear the void, but to respect its boundaries. Because it is in recognizing these limits that thought becomes truly critical and philosophy truly lucid. For Simone Weil, emptiness is not a punishment, it's a waiting. It's the silent space where the divine hides so that we can, at last, become worthy of receiving it. The absence of God, so often felt as abandonment, is for her the greatest gesture of love, a call for the soul to mature. In her mystical and philosophical view, God does not impose himself. he withdraws. And in that retreat, he gives human beings the chance to choose, to purify themselves, to desire the good not out of reward or fear, but out of selfless love. The void, then, is like a desert, arid, demanding, but fertile for deep transformation. Simone Weil believed that full presence is only possible when the ego is emptied. The soul must empty itself of desires, illusions, and the urge to possess. Only then can it become a quiet, receptive, available space. Evil, according to her, is what falsely fills that space: power, pride, domination. Good, on the other hand, is light, subtle, almost imperceptible, and for that reason, it can only be perceived by a soul made attentive through pain, waiting, and silence. God does not enter where there is already noise. His presence is like light that can only be seen in the dark. And that's why suffering, for Weil, is not only pain, but possibility. When everything is taken from us, when no help seems to come, that is when the space for absolute attention is born. And that attention, for her, is the purest form of prayer. She writes that God can only love himself in his creatures. This means that when the self dissolves, what remains is a space where the good can pass through, like light through a stained glass window emptied of ego. This theology of silence is radical. It doesn't ask for noise, promises, or blind belief. It asks for inner emptiness, a surrender with no guarantees, a waiting with no guarantees, and in that lies its beauty. God hides not to punish, but to teach us to love what is invisible. Absence, then, is not a lack. It's an invitation, a preparation. The void is not a hole. It is the shape of the fullness yet to come. When Freud explored the deepest impulses of the human psyche, he uncovered something unsettling. Beneath the drive for pleasure, survival, and connection, there was another force, silent, hidden, yet constant. He called it Thanatos, the death drive, while the life instinct, Eros, pushes us forward, seeking union, pleasure, and creation. Thanatos moves in the opposite direction. It wants to return to the inorganic, dissolve tension, erase consciousness. It's not a conscious wish to die, but a deep tendency within our very structure, a desire to cease, to be still, to disappear into the void. Freud saw this in certain repetitive, self-destructive behaviors, or in the compulsion to relive traumas. Something in us doesn't just want to live, it also wants to stop living. It wants to return to the state before pain, before desire, even before birth. Non-existence appears paradoxically as a kind of absolute rest. This idea defies modern optimism. For Freud, the human psyche is in constant conflict between the drive to exist and the wish to vanish, between Eros, which builds, and Thanatos, which dismantles. The death drive isn't necessarily tragic. It's part of nature. Everything that lives moves toward dissolution, and perhaps deep down knows it. The desire for the void isn't always a scream. Sometimes it's a whisper that quietly accompanies every choice, every failure, every moment of exhaustion. Freud didn't treat Thanatos as a villain, but as a structural force. Civilization itself, with its rules, repressions, and norms, is an attempt to contain this impulse. But it returns, in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in urges we deny. It shows up in melancholy, in apathy, in the quiet wish to disappear without drama. In the end, psychoanalysis reveals that living is a constant negotiation between the will to remain and the temptation to fade away, between the desire for fullness and the call of the void. Freud offers no comfort, only clarity. Within us is a pull toward the end. Recognizing it isn't surrender, it's understanding that even the darkest impulse carries part of our truth. Life pulses between two poles, and the void, far from being a mistake, may simply be the other side of existence. Inside each of us, there is a place we avoid looking at, a dark territory made of everything we deny, repress, or pretend not to be. Jung called this dimension the shadow, and it's not just a small psychological detail. It's the mirror of what we cannot bear to acknowledge. The shadow is made up of impulses, traits, memories, and desires that don't fit the image we have of ourselves. From an early age, we learn what is acceptable or right, and everything that doesn't fit that mold gets pushed to the depths of the psyche. It doesn't disappear, it just sinks deeper, forming an inner abyss. It's in this denied void that the shadow lives. But it doesn't stay quiet. What is rejected comes back. And when it returns without being understood, it takes on monstrous forms. Disproportionate irritations, emotional outbursts, addictions, projections. Often, what we see as evil in others is simply a reflection of what we can't stand to see in ourselves. Jung was clear. The unconscious is not a dead storage space, but a living reality that acts, feels, and desires. And the more we ignore it, the more power it gains. The monster is not born from evil itself, but from the silence surrounding our inner truth. Denying the shadow is living divided, existing on the surface while something inside us screams from the depths. But Jung didn't see the shadow as an enemy. He saw it as a path. Integrating it is one of the greatest acts of courage. It's not about giving in to dark impulses, but about recognizing them, speaking with them, and understanding their origin. Only then does the abyss stop devouring us, and instead becomes a source of self-knowledge. It's by descending into our own underworld that the mythical hero is transformed. It's by facing fear, chaos, and inner helplessness that we find the hidden gold. Jung called this process individuation, becoming whole by bringing together light and shadow, reason and instinct, consciousness and the unconscious. The void we fear so much, that inner space where all we've denied lives, is not our enemy. It's the ground where truth can finally be revealed, and where the soul can stop living only halfway. The shadow dwells in the abyss, but facing it is the only way to return with the light. For Otto Rank, one of Freud's most original disciples, the self, what we call identity, ego, personality, is not a starting point. It's a defensive construction, a constant effort to deal with the most inescapable of fears, the fear of death. From the very first moments of life, the human being faces a brutal rupture. At birth, we are torn from a state of unconscious totality, a state of unity with the mother's body, and thrown into the world of separation, time, and limitation. It is in this primal trauma that the ego begins to form, as a response to the terror of disappearing. Rank saw the fear of death not just as something biological or instinctive, but as an existential fear, an absolute void, an abyss the human mind discovers far too early, and against which it must react. The ego, then, emerges as a kind of armor. We create an identity to resist nothingness. We shape a self with stories, values, desires, and promises, all to sustain the illusion of permanence in a world where everything is temporary. This idea is as powerful as it is unsettling. Much of what we are is, in large part, a denial of what we fear to be, finite, fragile, mortal. But the consequence of this construction is paradoxical. The more we try to assert the self, the more we feed our inner conflict. We seek to be unique, grand, invincible, but the bigger the image we create, the greater the effort required to defend it. Life becomes a battle against inner collapse. Rank observed that even our creations, art, religion, science, are born from this attempt to transcend death. Every work, every belief, every symbol is an attempt to touch eternity with the hands of time. But deep down, it's always the same cry: I don't want to disappear. Still, Rank did not see this with cynicism. He believed that recognizing this fear is the first step toward overcoming it. Only when we admit that the ego is born from existential terror can we begin to live with more truth and less illusion. not to eliminate the fear, but to stop being its slave. The self is a response to the abyss, but maybe freedom begins when we stop running and learn to look nothingness in the eye. Erich Fromm saw something unsettling at the heart of modern life. As we gained more freedom, political, religious, and individual, we also became more lonely, anxious, and uncertain. Freedom, which should have been liberating, turned into a burden. But why? For Fromm, freedom confronts us with a truth we'd rather avoid. There is no longer anything outside of us telling us who we are. In the past, authority came from outside, from traditions, dogmas, customs. Everything was set. Social roles, beliefs, behaviors. There were clear boundaries, and within them, a sense of belonging, even if it came at the cost of autonomy. With the fall of those structures, we began living under the weight of choice. We gained the possibility of becoming anything, but along with it came the terror of being nothing. Freedom exposes the void. It strips us bare, leaving us face to face with the vertigo of existing without a manual. And in that exposure, we feel the abyss. Full freedom demands an inner response, but often the modern individual doesn't find that strength within. Instead of using freedom to become authentic, they run from it, adapting, submitting, dissolving into the crowd. Fromm calls this the escape from freedom, the psychological mechanism by which we give up autonomy to avoid anxiety. This escape can take many forms: conformity, blind obedience, compulsive consumption, radical ideologies, anything that gives us a sense of stability, but in reality, alienates us even more. We keep trying to fill ourselves, but what we're really trying to hide is the emptiness of a self that doesn't know what to be. For Fromm, the way forward is not to deny this emptiness, but to face it with courage. He proposes a freedom that is not just freedom from, freedom as escape, but freedom to become, to create, to love, to act with awareness. True freedom requires maturity. It's the ability to live with uncertainty, to take responsibility for our own existence, and to build meaning from within, not something imposed, but something lived. The abyss is real, but it is not the end. It's the space where the true self can finally be born, and freedom, far from being a curse, can be the deepest opportunity for human fulfillment, if we have the courage to face it. Nietzsche warns us with a powerful and unsettling image. The abyss has eyes, and they're not just there, still and passive, waiting in silence. They look back, because the abyss is not only what we see outside ourselves, it's also what awakens within us when we dare to contemplate it for too long. The abyss is the place of meaninglessness, chaos, and the absence of fixed values. It's the space where God is dead, where there are no absolute truths or metaphysical guarantees. Facing it is an act of extreme courage, but Nietzsche cautions. In doing so, we do not come away unchanged. Looking into the void can transform us. The search for truth, clarity, and authentic freedom is not a neutral path. When we strip away comforting illusions, inherited morals, consoling beliefs, ready-made structures, we risk finding not light, but the darkness of a world without foundations. And that darkness challenges us. It tests us. It whispers that everything is relative, that nothing matters, that there's no ultimate reason to go on. It asks, can you handle knowing that nothing has a final why? If we're not prepared, we can be swallowed by nihilism, that emptiness where everything loses its value. That's why Nietzsche says, be careful. Fighting monsters, whether systems, beliefs, or lies, can make us monsters too. The line between clarity and destruction is thin. The challenge is not only to face the abyss, but to cross it without losing yourself. The gaze of the abyss is, in truth, our own distorted reflection. It's our shadow projected into the vastness. And for that very reason, it can also be a mirror. A dark mirror, yes, but a revealing one. Nietzsche doesn't want to stop us from looking. He wants us to look firmly, with inner strength, to be capable of creating values even inside the void, to affirm life even without guarantees, because only those who face the abyss and keep walking can finally become creators. Antonin Artaud didn't see the body as just a biological structure, nor as an instrument in service of reason. For him, the body was a field of forces, of conflicts, of raw desires, a stage where the self dissolves, where the void takes on living form. His cry was against order, against domesticated language, against the morality that represses, the culture that organizes, the theater that merely represents. Artaud wanted raw truth, the kind that exists before thought, before identity, before form. That's why he spoke of a body without organs, not a literal idea, but a symbolic one. A body stripped of imposed functions, fixed roles, and the social and psychological machinery that imprisons it. A body freed from the anatomy of the ego. This body without organs is not absence, but pure potential, a territory where anything can still happen. In it, the self, with its masks, names, and stories, is destroyed. And in its place, what remains is the cry, the void, the primal vibration of naked existence. Artaud didn't want to cure the pain of existence. He wanted to cross through it, to push it to its limit. For him, suffering was the point of contact with the real, because it reveals what conventions hide, the chaos that lives inside us. In this chaos, there is no longer subject or object, no more representation, only a body in a state of intensity, of collapse and creation. For Artaud, art must be ritual, not imitation. It must affect, disturb, and shatter the illusion of a stable identity. His theatre of cruelty was not gratuitous violence, but a call for symbolic collapse, to tear down the false self, so that something more real, more vital, could emerge. The body, in this sense, is the stage where the void is inscribed, not as lifeless absence, but as an active, shadowy space where language fails, yet the cry still speaks. Artaud invites us to this radical confrontation, to destroy the self in order to free the body. Not to get lost in chaos, but to rediscover, beneath the rubble, another way of being. One that comes before the name, before the form, before the domesticated world. An empty body, but alive. Michel Foucault invites us to face an unsettling idea. What we call man, the autonomous, rational subject with a stable identity and an inherent essence, is a historical construction. And like any construction, it can disappear. According to him, there is no self behind our actions. What exists is a network of discourses, languages, knowledge systems, norms, and social practices that shape what we believe ourselves to be. The subject, in this sense, is not the origin of knowledge, but its effect. And contrary to what many philosophical traditions have claimed, there is no hidden essence behind language. There are only discourses that take turns holding the power to decide what is truth. Foucault devoted his work to tracing these discursive formations, how we speak about madness, sexuality, crime, the body. Each era organizes its own knowledge, sets its limits, and defines what can be said and thought. And it is within this field that the subject is born. But if it can be born within a field of knowledge, it can also be erased by it. This is the idea of the end of man, not as a biological extinction, but as the collapse of a fiction. The human being, as the center of the universe, bearer of unconditional truth and freedom, is an image dissolving at the edges of contemporary thought. The death of the subject is not silence, it's excess. It's the moment when so many discourses compete for the right to define the self that there is no longer a single, recognizable self. Multiplicity reveals the void. What we think we are, our identity, our desires, even our sanity, is all historically produced, and it can be undone. But this diagnosis is not meant to be despairing. Foucault does not hand us over to nihilism. He offers us freedom. If there is no essence, then there is space. Space to resist, to reinvent, to break away from what has been imposed on us. In the void left by the death of the subject, there are no ruins. There is possibility. We are no longer prisoners of a single truth about ourselves. We are now the authors of what can still be said. For Lacan, human desire does not arise from biological need. It's not like hunger or thirst, which can be satisfied by something tangible. Desire, as he understands it, comes from a lack, a void that can never be completely filled. This lack is neither accidental nor pathological. It is structural. The human subject is, from the very beginning, marked by absence, by incompleteness. And it is this ontological wound that generates desire, a continuous movement towards something that, deep down, doesn't exist as a real object, but as a promise. Lacan says, desire is the desire of the other. This means we desire what we imagine the other desires from us, or what would make us desirable to them. From childhood, we are shaped by gazes, words, and expectations. We are brought into language, and in that process, we lose something, the imagined sense of wholeness. The self that emerges is already a divided self, alienated, searching for an impossible return to a state of fullness. The emptiness we feel is not simply a hole waiting to be filled. It's a constitutive absence. And every time we try to satisfy it, with objects, relationships, achievements, what we actually get is substitution, displacement, a postponement of the original lack. Desire, then, has no end, because it has no fixed object. It moves, disguises itself, transforms, but never resolves. Fantasy tries to trick us with images of completeness, the ideal love, ultimate success, the perfect identity, but all of these collapse when touched by reality. Lacan invites us to give up the idea of complete satisfaction. Instead, he proposes embracing our condition as beings who desire, as our destiny. Living is not about filling the void, it's about dancing around it. It's recognizing that we are driven by something we can never reach, yet which moves us, unsettles us, and pushes us to create. Dissatisfaction, far from being a flaw, is the engine of the subject. It's what launches us into the world, makes us speak, love, and dream. Desire is never fulfilled, but it's in this endless movement that existence gains depth. The void of the other is not an end, it's the origin. And it's there that the subject, even in its fragmentation, finds its most authentic way of living. For Georges Bataille, to live fully is not to preserve oneself, it's to transgress oneself. It's to cross the boundaries imposed on us by fear, morality, and rational order. Life, he says, becomes most intense precisely when it touches its own extremes, when it approaches what terrifies us. Death, the void, the end. What he calls ecstasy is not superficial pleasure. It's a limit experience, a moment when the self dissolves, when the subject surrenders to the unspeakable, the uncontrollable. For Bataille, ecstasy is a collision with the abyss, a moment of fusion with what lies beyond reason. This radical encounter with the end can happen in many forms: in eroticism, in violence, in uncontrollable laughter, in sacrifice, in the contemplation of tragedy. All these experiences share something in common. They suspend the rules, dissolve identity, and reveal the fragility of the self. Bataille saw transgression as a sacred act, not in the traditional religious sense, but as a way of breaking free from the utilitarian logic of everyday life. Life, for him, is not only production, progress, and accumulation. There is also waste, excess, and expenditure, that which escapes control. And it's here that the void becomes ecstasy. When we transgress, when we go beyond what is permitted, something in us dies. But it's this small death that brings us closer to the real. The symbolic death of the self, of control, of form, makes room for a more primal, raw, and intense experience of existence. Bataille opposed the idea of a life organized around stability. For him, the deepest desire of the human being is to touch the impossible, to go to the end, to feel what lies beyond language. In this gesture, we encounter the void, not as sterile absence, but as absurd fullness, as excess, as rupture. Ecstasy is this: the moment we stop belonging to ourselves, when something breaks and escapes us, when meaning falls apart, and yet presence remains. In the end, Bataille shows us that life only reaches its highest intensity when we dare to cross what threatens us, and that, at times, the void is not the negation of life, but its most radical form. Thomas Legotti is not a philosopher in the traditional academic sense. He's a writer of horror, but his horror doesn't come from external monsters. It comes from the very fact of existing. He moves in the territory where human consciousness is not a blessing, but a curse. To be conscious is to be sick, and the name of that sickness is existence. Inspired by Schopenhauer, Kioran, and the depths of cosmic pessimism, Legotti claims that nature's greatest mistake was producing a being that knows it exists, a being capable of perceiving death, futility, and the void, and yet is forced to go on. For him, consciousness is a tragic anomaly. While other creatures simply live, instinctively, without asking why, the human being carries the weight of awareness, and that awareness does not set us free. It weighs us down. Legotti describes life as a spectacle of the absurd, where everything keeps turning mechanically without real meaning, and where suffering is inevitable. The mere fact of being alive is, in itself, a burden. Unlike existentialists who propose an ethical or creative response to the absurd, Legotti offers no way out. His vision is antinatalist, nihilistic, and radical. The only way to ease suffering would be to avoid consciousness altogether, or never to have been born. In this view, the void appears not as a threat, but as the only possible comfort. It is absolute rest, non-consciousness, eternal silence where there is no more pain, no desire, no memory. This extreme perspective is uncomfortable, and precisely for that reason, powerful, because it forces us to confront questions we usually avoid. What if consciousness is a mistake? What if meaning is just a desperate invention? What if the void is more real than any belief? Legotti doesn't write to comfort, but to expose, to say what almost no one dares to admit, that life can indeed be a trap, a theatre without an audience, where consciousness watches helplessly as it all falls apart. In the end, his dark philosophy points to a brutal revelation. There is no salvation in clarity, but perhaps there is a strange kind of freedom in recognizing nothingness. Human beings are creatures that ask questions. Since the beginning, we've looked at the sky, at nature, at ourselves, and wanted to know, why? Why are we here? Why do we suffer? What's the purpose of all this? But according to Kamu, the world does not answer. There's no voice in the universe, no ultimate explanation, no higher plan, no instruction manual handed to us at birth. Only silence. This clash between the human need for meaning and the mute indifference of reality is what Kamu calls the absurd. The absurd is not the world itself, nor is it just within us. It's the friction between the two, a cry echoing into empty space. And when that emptiness is revealed, many feel the urge to turn away, to escape, through religion, ideology, or illusion. Kamu, however, proposes something bolder: to stay, to stand before the absurd, to look it in the eye without creating artificial justifications, without appealing to gods, destiny, or comforting explanations. Because for him, this clarity is not the end. It's the beginning of a new kind of freedom. When we realize life has no given meaning, we understand that we are the ones who can give it meaning, not as an eternal truth, but as a creative, personal choice in the moment. The absence of absolute meaning creates space for individual responsibility. Camus does not deny the void, he accepts it, And in that acceptance, he finds the foundation for a dignified life. Because to live absurdly is not to fall into despair, it's to keep walking, even knowing the ground beneath you is fragile. That's what he sees in Sisyphus, condemned to roll his stone for eternity. His life is absurd, yes, but he persists. And Kamu tells us, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. The answer to the absurd, then, doesn't come from outside. It comes from an inner stance, from the person who says, I don't know why I'm here, but I am. And since I am, I will live with courage, with clarity, and with whatever beauty is possible. The world may be silent, but we are not. And maybe, in the end, to live is to shout, even knowing the void will only return the echo. For Cioran, lucidity is a burden. To see the world as it truly is, without veils, without illusions, without unfounded hopes, inevitably leads to the experience of absurdity, disillusionment, and existential anguish. But unlike many thinkers who try to find some kind of redemptive meaning, Cioran does not attempt to save life through philosophy. He observes it in ruins and writes from that place. In his work, suicide is not encouraged as an act, but acknowledged as an existential possibility. It is always there, lurking, not as tragedy, but as comfort, an escape route, the door that is always open, even when everything else feels locked. For Cioran, thinking about suicide does not necessarily mean wanting to die. It means recognizing with cold clarity that life has no ultimate justification, that there is no promise of future reward, no higher plan to give meaning to suffering. And yet, we remain here. This contradiction, knowing everything is in vain and still staying, is what defines tragic lucidity. The thought of suicide, far from being an irrational impulse, becomes a form of radical clarity. I can leave at any time, and it's precisely for that reason that each moment is mine. Far from despair, this awareness can even bring lightness. The lightness of someone who expects nothing, and therefore can simply watch, exist, feel, without the obligation to find meaning in everything. Cioran saw existence as a causeless evil, an irony of the universe, but he also recognized that there is beauty in the collapse of it all, a kind of bitter, yet real, freedom. He did not glorify suicide, he understood it, and paradoxically, it was this deep acceptance of death as an alternative that kept him alive. For him, suicide was an idea, a loyal shadow that accompanied every thought and gave suffering a bearable outline. To think about death is not necessarily to want to die. It is perhaps the most honest way to measure the weight of life. And in that thought, Cioran finds not an ending, but a rare kind of serenity, the kind that only comes when nothing needs to make sense anymore. Few things inspire as much fear as death. It seems like the end of everything, the body, memory, relationships, and consciousness itself. And yet, for Epicurus, this fear is a mistake, a logical and emotional misunderstanding. Founder of one of the most influential schools of philosophy in ancient Greece, Epicurus believed that philosophy should help us live with greater serenity, and to do that, it is essential to free ourselves from the fear of death. His approach is simple but deeply transformative. Death cannot be an experience for the living, and for the one who has died, it is nothing, because there is no longer a subject to experience it. The fear of death, according to him, comes from confusing life with nothingness. We imagine death as some kind of eternal suffering, a conscious void, or a loss we could somehow regret. But all of these images come from the perspective of someone still alive. For Epicurus, death is simply the end of sensation. When we die, there is no more pain, no fear, no time, and no us. Consciousness fades, and with it, everything that could suffer. This reflection is not meant to be cold or indifferent. On the contrary, it is meant to be liberating. If we understand that death is not an experience, neither good nor bad, we can focus on the only thing that truly belongs to us, the present. Life for Epicurus should be guided by pleasure, not excessive pleasure, but the pleasure of balance, friendship, and inner freedom. And nothing gets in the way of that pleasure more than unnecessary fear. Knowing that death is a limit and not a tragedy changes how we live. It helps us value the moments, the simple gestures, the genuine relationships. When we accept that death is not an evil, we stop being prisoners of anxiety and become more whole in our living. Epicurus did not want to convince us that death is beautiful. He wanted to show us that it is simply nothing. And for that reason alone, it does not deserve our fear, only our clarity. At the heart of the Buddha's teaching is a profound and challenging insight. Suffering arises from desire, and desire arises from the illusion that there is a fixed, separate, permanent self. This illusion is so convincing that we spend our entire lives trying to protect it, satisfy it, and feed it, without realizing that it is the root of our suffering. In Buddhism, the self is not a stable entity. It's a constantly changing collection of sensations, thoughts, memories, and impulses. Like a flame, it appears continuous, but is always renewing itself. There is no essence, no core, no permanent soul behind experience. Clinging to this construction is like trying to hold water in your hands. Nirvana, then, is not the destruction of life, but the extinction of the illusion. It is the extinguishing of the fire of desire, attachment, and fear. It is not nothingness in the Western sense, but a radical liberation from the cycle of suffering. It is the peace that arises when there is no longer anyone who needs to fight, accumulate, or resist. The extinction of the self, far from being annihilation, is a return to reality as it truly is, impermanent, interdependent, and free from ego. Human suffering, according to the Buddha, does not come from things themselves, but from the way we relate to them, with craving, with aversion, with attachment. When we let go of this structure of self, the world does not disappear. It is revealed. Without the filter of the ego, everything can be seen with clarity, compassion, and serenity. The path to this liberation is gradual and practical. Meditation, ethics, mindfulness, and letting go are ways of emptying the self, not through denial, but through understanding. When we deeply understand the transient nature of all things, including ourselves, desire loses its hold, and with it, suffering dissolves. The Buddha does not propose a dark ending, but a luminous awakening, a state where there is no ego to defend and no pain to resist, only presence, clarity, and freedom. To extinguish the self is, ultimately, to stop being a prisoner of yourself, and in doing so, to discover what it truly means to live. For Augustine, hell is not a place of literal fire and torture. It is something deeper, more existential, the absolute emptiness of a soul separated from God. It is the consequence of a voluntary refusal of the love that sustains everything that exists. For Augustine, God is fullness of being, eternal, the source of all goodness and meaning. He not only created the world, he sustains it at every moment. Existence, order, beauty, and even the very capacity to love all come from him. That's why turning away from God is more than a moral error. It is the disintegration of one's very being. Evil, in this view, does not have its own independent existence. It is rather the absence of good, just as darkness is the absence of light. Hell, therefore, is not an active creation of God meant to punish, but the natural result of the soul's separation from the very source of its meaning. A soul that rejects God is also rejecting itself, denying its source, its direction, and its end. And this rejection, this proud and radical closing off, leads to the deepest of all human experiences, absolute emptiness, an emptiness with no echo, no comfort, no presence, not the divine silence, but total absence, a loneliness that no longer expects an answer. Augustine teaches that God never abandons the soul. It is the soul that loses itself when it clings to created things, to passing pleasures, to the pride of the ego. Yet even in suffering, there remains the possibility of return. Hell becomes final only when the soul completely closes itself to love. This love is demanding, yes, but it is also what sets us free. God, according to Augustine, does not force his presence. He invites, and it is this invitation that marks the difference between fullness and condemnation. The soul that turns back to God finds its being again. The one that refuses him experiences nothingness. In the end, Augustine warns us, the greatest punishment is not pain. It is the absence of love. Hell does not burn from the outside. It consumes from within. Because nothing is more terrible than to exist without the very thing that gives us our reason to exist. For Emmanuel Levinas, the meaning of existence is not found within us. It is found outside, in the encounter with the other. It is in this meeting that the void of solitary experience is broken, and something absolutely new appears: ethics. For centuries, Western philosophy sought truth in being, in reason, in the self. Levinas turns this logic upside down. For him, the self is not the starting point, but a response to something that comes first: the face of the other. This face is not merely a physical feature. It represents the living, vulnerable presence of someone I cannot reduce, control, or fit into my own categories. When I look at the face of the other, it addresses me, unsettles me, calls to me. It is not a look that asks, but one that commands, "You are responsible for me." This call is not born from a rational contract or a social convention. It is prior to all of that. It is a primordial ethical obligation that shapes me as a subject. Before I even know who I am already called to answer for the other. In this sense, the face of the other breaks the existential void. Where before there was only the self, closed in on itself, searching for meaning, facing the absurd, staring into nothingness. Now there is an opening, a breach. An appeal from beyond that gives the human being a place in the world. For Levinas, the void is not overcome by contemplation or logic, but by encounter. Meaning is not born in the isolation of the self, but in the welcoming of otherness. The other saves me from solipsism, from nihilism, from indifference. They are the ethical anti-void because they compel me to step outside myself, to commit, to care. This responsibility, however, has no end. It is infinite, because the other can never be reduced to an object or a function. They are always more than I can comprehend, and precisely for that reason, they continue to call me. Levinas shows us that true meaning does not come from inwardness, but from relationship, that the face of the other is not a threat, but an invitation to humanity, and that, in the face of the void the world so often presents, the only true response is care. For Zhuangzi, one of the great masters of Taoism, death is not a tragedy. It is simply a change of form, a transition within the eternal flow of the Tao, the invisible path that runs through all things. Nature is never fixed. Everything moves, transforms, disappears, and returns. To resist death, then, is to resist nature itself. The human mind, however, fears the end. We create stories, beliefs, and structures to deny the inevitable. But this refusal takes us away from the living reality, from the cycle that pulses through everything. According to Zhuangzi, wisdom lies in accepting and even celebrating this impermanence. Life and death are only states within the same process, like day and night, summer and winter. There's a well-known story about Zhuangzi that illustrates this beautifully. When his wife died, a friend came to console him and found him singing and clapping his hands. Surprised, the friend asked, "Aren't you sad?" And Zhuangzi replied, "When she died, I wept. But then I realized that death is part of the cycle. She existed before she was born, and now she has simply returned to the void. The void here is not absolute nothingness, but the space from which everything arises and to which everything returns. It is the Tao in its purest state, silent, formless, yet fertile. Just as a vessel is useful because of the empty space it contains, Life has meaning only within its dance with death. Zhuangzi invites us to let go of rigidity, attachment, and control. To live lightly is to flow with the Tao, accepting that everything is in constant change. When we resist the end, we suffer twice, once from the inevitable loss, and again from wishing it were otherwise. But when we surrender to the flow, we find a different kind of peace, the kind that comes from not fighting the cycle of existence. Death, then, is not an interruption, but a gentle dissolution. The self fades, but the Tao remains. Like drops that evaporate and return to the cloud, nothing truly disappears. Everything simply changes form. Blaise Pascal saw the human being as a paradoxical creature, fragile like a reed, a breakable plant, vulnerable to wind, to time, to chance, yet possessing something no other creature has, the awareness of its own fragility. We are small before the universe. We occupy an almost invisible point in the vastness of space and time. A single breath could destroy us. And yet, we are capable of contemplating that vastness. We are, at the same time, part of the void and the only beings able to perceive it. This contrast is what defines both the greatness and the despair of the human condition. Pascal does not try to hide the abyss. He faces it. He sees in humanity a tension between greatness and misery, light and darkness, finitude and the longing for infinity. We are miserable because we are finite, but we are great because we know we are. Our anguish comes from this very awareness. Animals do not know they will die. Stones do not wonder why they exist. But man, the thinking reed, carries within him the weight of unanswered questions. Why am I here? What lies beyond death? What is the meaning of all this? And often, the world does not answer. The universe, in its vast and silent immensity, throws us back into the void. Pascal does not turn to reason to solve this dilemma. On the contrary, he sees reason as limited before the ultimate mysteries. It is not through logic that one finds the meaning of life, but through the heart, through faith, through surrender to the divine. But even those who do not share his faith can find in his view something deeply human, the courage to face our own smallness without running from it. Pascal reminds us that consciousness is both our burden and our dignity. The void is not avoided, but recognized as part of who we are. And in that recognition is born an ethic of humility, a spirituality of limits, a wisdom of lucidity. In the end, the thinking reed does not conquer the void by force, but by awareness. And that awareness, however painful, is what makes us truly human. For Henry Bergson, the time we usually think of, the one marked by the hands of a clock, divided into seconds, minutes, and hours, is not real time. It's just a practical representation, useful for daily life, but incapable of capturing the true experience of consciousness. Real time, the time we actually live, is what Bergson calls duration, durée. It is not a succession of frozen instants like photos lined up in an album. It's a continuous flow, an indivisible current where the past merges with the present and projects into the future, like a melody in motion. And it is in this lived, fluid, creative time that life actually happens. When we treat the present as a static point, an isolated instant, we open the door to the feeling of emptiness, as if there were gaps between moments, interruptions in our being. But for Bergson, this is an illusion created by analytical thought, by language, by abstraction. In the reality of duration, there are no breaks. The present is not a fragment, but a continuous vibration of transformation. Every second carries the weight of what came before and the potential of what is yet to come. Consciousness doesn't jump from moment to moment. It stretches, extends, and creates itself. That's why the void doesn't exist as a real absence, but as an effect of the way we artificially separate what is, in truth, always in continuity. This view has deep implications. Instead of seeking meaning in fixed markers, in a frozen past or an idealized future, Bergson invites us to inhabit the present as movement, not as a still now, but as creation in progress. Life, in this perspective, is not something to be measured. It's something to be felt, to be lived from within. And to live, for Bergson, is to reinvent oneself at every instant, to participate in a flow where each moment contains more than any description could capture. In the end, what seems like emptiness is only a pause in our gaze. Real time, the time of life, does not stop, does not fragment, does not repeat. And in that creative flow, being affirms itself, and the void dissolves. For Baudrillard, we no longer live in a world where reality is the foundation of experience. We are surrounded by images, signs, and representations that no longer point to anything beyond themselves. They don't represent reality, they have replaced it. He calls this hyperreality, a universe where what is broadcast, consumed, and felt no longer has a direct connection to the real world, but instead to simulations, copies without an original, meanings without a reference. In this world, the void is not an accidental absence, it's a structural norm. We live in the simulacrum of the end because everything that once seemed solid, truth, history, identity, even the very idea of the end, has been absorbed by the logic of simulation. Death no longer moves us as it once did. It is aestheticized in films, games, and TV shows. Revolt has become a product. Trauma has become entertainment. Even the end has been domesticated. Baudrillard warns, collapse will not be felt as collapse, but as spectacle, because reality no longer has the power to interrupt the flow of images. Disaster becomes news, crisis becomes a trend, and the end of the world becomes viral content. In this scenario, the subject also becomes hollow. We are no longer agents but consumers of simulacra. Our emotions, desires, and values are shaped by signs that have no depth. Life becomes a performance. The self becomes a profile. Experience becomes a record. And at the center of it all pulses the void, not as a painful absence, but as a permanent neutrality. Nothing truly shocks. Everything is absorbed. Hyperreality doesn't destroy the real. It makes it irrelevant. The distinction between true and false loses its meaning. Life becomes a chain of signs that guide us, but reveal nothing. And so, the end comes not as an explosion, but as indifference. Baudrillard is not a prophet of the apocalypse, but a cartographer of the present. He shows us that the danger is not in the end itself, but in the possibility that it may have already happened, and no one noticed. In the end, we no longer live reality. We live its ghost. And in this world without weight, without truth, and without center, the void has already won, smiling in high definition. For philosopher and neuroscientist Thomas Metzinger, the self as a stable, inner entity simply doesn't exist. There's no someone inside the brain controlling thoughts, decisions, and emotions. What actually exists is a functional model, complex, coherent, and illusory, created by the mind itself. Metzinger calls this the ego tunnel, a continuous simulation generated by the brain to organize experience. This simulation makes us feel as though we are a person with unity, will, and identity. But according to him, this is only an evolutionary interface, a useful construction, not a real essence. This construction emerged for adaptive reasons. Being able to represent oneself as a cohesive agent provided evolutionary advantages. It made decision-making easier, improved social navigation, and supported group survival. The self, then, is not a being, it's a strategy, an interface between body and world, designed to maintain functionality, not to reveal truth. The problem is that the illusion is complete. We believe we are this self, and we suffer because of it. We suffer trying to protect it, assert it, and make it last forever. We create narratives, identities, and belief systems to sustain something that, in practice, is just a set of transient processes. For Metzinger, This doesn't mean we should abandon subjective experience or fall into nihilism. On the contrary, recognizing the illusory nature of the self can set us free. It can open space for a clearer ethics, for a spirituality without dogma, for a life less centered on defending a rigid identity. He points to contemplative practices, like meditation, that allow us to observe the gradual dissolution of the self, not as a loss, but as a relief, an opening to a lighter, broader, less self-centered awareness. Metzinger's claim is radical. The self is an evolutionary mistake that became aware of itself. But that mistake brought us this far, and now that we know this, we can choose to live differently, less attached to the illusion, more open to the flow of experience. In the end, real freedom might begin when we stop asking, "Who am I?" and start observing what happens when that "I" simply disappears. For Lacan, love is not the meeting of two complete beings, but a pact between two lacks. We love not because we have something whole to offer, but because something is missing in us. And we see that same lack reflected in the other. Love, then, is not fusion, but projection, desire, and emptiness in motion. At the heart of Lacanian theory is the idea that the subject is defined by lack. From birth, we are thrown into language and separated from any original unity with the world. We spend our lives trying to fill this hole, the emptiness left by our entry into the symbolic order. It is from this absence that desire is born. We desire not the object itself, but what it represents of our own incompleteness. When we love, we offer something, but not something concrete. We offer the fantasy that we have what the other is missing. We promise meaning, wholeness, salvation, even if we don't fully understand what we're offering, and we accept from the other that same illusion. This is why Lacan says that love is giving what you don't have to someone who doesn't want it. What we offer is symbolic, imaginary, an attempt to cover the whole of existence. And the other, also lacking, cannot truly receive what we give because they too are searching for what they lack. Love, then, is an exchange of voids, a fragile pact between two lacks that recognize each other, touch for moments, but never fuse. This view may seem bitter, but it's deeply true. We don't love despite the lack. We love because of it. Lack is what moves us, connects us, keeps us desiring. Lacan doesn't destroy love. He strips away its idealization. He shows that it is not wholeness, but a symbolic game. Not redemption, but risk. Not fusion, but a constant negotiation with the difference and the abyss each person carries inside. True love, then, does not seek to erase the other's lack, but to respect it, inhabit it, remain even knowing it cannot be filled. It is this profoundly human act of standing before the void and still saying, "I'm here." Keiji Nishitani, a Japanese philosopher from the Kyoto school, built a unique bridge between Buddhist thought and the Western philosophical tradition. His proposal is both radical and deeply liberating. To overcome nihilism, you must go through it. You must enter absolute nothingness and remain there without fear. Modern nihilism, according to Nishitani, is born from the loss of meaning. The old certainties, God, truth, progress, identity, have crumbled. Without a fixed center, the human being sinks into an inner void that feels threatening. Nothing seems to have intrinsic value anymore. Everything feels contingent, relative, without foundation. But Nishitani invites us to see this void not as an end, but as a new beginning. He calls this process going to the bottom of nihilism. It's not enough to avoid the void or try to replace it with shallow beliefs or fragile hopes. You have to go through it completely. Let the ground dissolve, let the self fall apart, let illusions fall silent. And at the heart of this nothingness, something surprising happens. The appearance of a deeper void, not destructive, but foundational. This absolute nothingness, in Japanese, shunyata or ko, is not a negative absence. It is the condition that makes all things possible. The void is the field in which being takes place. Nothing has its own fixed essence. Everything arises, changes, and disappears in interdependence with everything else. In this sense, the void is more real than any fixed entity. It is reality in its pure dynamism. For Nishitani, accepting this absolute nothingness is the way to overcome nihilism creatively. It's not about returning to old certainties, but about living without needing them. A deep freedom emerges when we stop searching for a fixed self, a final meaning, or an external God. Instead, we find a silent presence, a communion with reality as it is, impermanent, interconnected, empty of essence, yet full of life. To overcome nihilism is not to deny the void. It is to discover that the void was never absence. It was always the open space of the deepest reality. For Schopenhauer, life is, by its very nature, suffering. And not because life went wrong, but because the very structure of existence is driven by a blind, relentless force he called the will. The will is not something we choose. It is what moves us, what desires within us before we even know what we want. Everything in nature is an expression of this will, the instincts of animals, the growth of plants, human desires. But in human beings, this will gains a new ingredient, consciousness. And with it, suffering deepens. To be conscious is to realize we are trapped in an endless cycle of wanting. We desire something, attain it, and soon desire something else. Brief satisfaction is always followed by a new lack, by frustration, by boredom. Life, for Schopenhauer, swings between the pain of what we lack and the emptiness of what we've already attained. In this sense, to live is to be condemned to desire and to suffer because of it. That's why he claims it would have been better never to be born. Non-being does not suffer. Where there is no will, there is no pain. Where there is no consciousness, there is no anguish. Non-existence is not a punishment, but a radical liberation. It's no surprise he drew inspiration from Buddhist thought and asceticism. The path to peace lies in the denial of the will, in the emptying of desire, in the silent renunciation of the illusion of the self. This view may seem dark, and it is, but within it is a strange form of compassion. Schopenhauer is not encouraging despair. He is exposing the structure of suffering so we can face it with clarity. And perhaps, in that clarity, a new kind of ethics can emerge. An ethics of compassion for all beings who suffer under the weight of the will. An ethics that recognizes the absurdity of existence and yet chooses to ease suffering wherever possible. Life hurts because it desires. And if desire is the root of pain, then non-being is not the end, but absolute rest. The silence where the will finally falls quiet. For Émile Cioran, one of the most lucid and despairing thinkers of the 20th century, the problem is not the lack of meaning. The problem is seeking it. The human drive to turn life into something meaningful, to find a higher purpose, is, for him, a trap, a refined form of despair. Cioran doesn't deny that this search drives us. On the contrary, he acknowledges that it's at the core of the human condition. But that's precisely what he calls out. The need for purpose, he says, reveals our inability to face reality as it is. Without justifications, without destiny, without salvation. This compulsive search for meaning, then, is a kind of metaphysical addiction. We create religions, ideologies, moral systems, and existential narratives, not because they are true, but because we can't bear the absurd. Like beggars for meaning, we cling to any promise of redemption, even if, deep down, we know they are fragile. For Cioran, living in search of meaning is feeding the cycle of suffering. Because in creating a purpose, we also create the expectation that it will be achieved, fulfilled, completed. And when that doesn't happen, and it usually doesn't, we feel frustrated, blame ourselves, and sink deeper into anguish. Seeking meaning is, therefore, a way of organizing our own failure. The paradox is cruel. We need meaning to keep living, but it's precisely that need that keeps us in agony. The more we want life to mean something, the more we realize how much it escapes any definition. And in that confrontation, what's left? For Shioran, silence. Not the silence of resignation, but the silence of lucidity, a kind of bitter freedom that comes when we stop demanding that existence explain itself to us. Shioran offers no solution, he offers no hope. His philosophy is a broken yet honest mirror. And maybe that's why it frees us. Because when we abandon the prison of meaning, we discover the lightness of simply being, without why, without destiny, without chains. In the end, the only mistake is expecting life to make sense. The rest is just living and enduring. For Heidegger, language plays an ambiguous role. It is at the same time the opening to being and its concealment. Through language, we make the world understandable. We name, describe, interpret. But by doing this constantly, we end up covering over the abyss that underlies all existence. Being, that which allows things to appear as what they are, cannot be spoken of directly. Every attempt to explain it precisely ends up reducing it to concepts, formulas, dead words, and in doing so, we move further away from its living experience. Heidegger suggests that the more we talk, the further we drift from what is essential. For him, nothing is not an absolute void, but the silent horizon where being reveals itself. And it is precisely the excess of talk, explanations, technical jargon, and superficial language that blinds us to that revelation. We live in an age which he calls Gerede, or idle talk, where automatic speech replaces deep listening. We talk about everything but understand almost nothing. Silence, on the other hand, is not the absence of language, it is its preparation. True silence is not the mere lack of sound, but the listening of being. It is when we stop trying to dominate the world with words and instead allow it to be what it is. In silence, being is not explained, but felt. And in that sense, silence approaches nothing, not as annihilation, but as radical openness. Heidegger invites us to return to silence, not to escape language, but to purify it. To remember that words should not fill everything, but create space for the unsayable. The most authentic language, for him, is not the one that speaks constantly, but the one that knows when to fall silent. Thus, speaking too much is not just noise, it is forgetfulness. Forgetfulness of being, of mystery, of the nothing that makes us what we are. The emptiness we try to cover with words may, paradoxically, be the very space where truth appears. In the end, Heidegger calls us not to say more, but to listen to what only silence can reveal. For Henri Bergson, remembering is not reliving the past as it truly was. It is recreating the past in the present, shaped by our current state of consciousness, our emotions, fears, desires, and interpretations. That's why memory is not a faithful reproduction of reality, but a living, fluid construction, and in many ways, an illusion. Memory is like an ornamented void, a space where what was once lived is already gone, yet filled with fragments rearranged by imagination and emotion. We don't remember things as they happened, but as they have become for us. The past, according to Bergson, is neither dead nor fixed. It remains alive in the present, but blended with the now, shaped by who we are today. This means that when we recall something, we are not accessing an objective photograph, but touching a vibration, a duration that has been woven into our way of being. Memory, then, is not an archive, but an inner movement, and that is precisely why it is so beautiful and so deceptive. When we remember, we edit. We suppress what hurts, amplify what we love, fill in the gaps with assumptions, feelings, or stories that may never have happened. And we don't do this out of malice, but because consciousness is not a machine, it is life. And life reshapes everything in motion, including memory. This reconstruction of the past should not be seen as falsification, but as the creativity of the mind. Human beings need to tell themselves stories, and memory is the stage where those stories are performed. Still, humility is needed. Nothing was exactly as we remember it. Our past is a malleable field that serves the present more than it serves objective truth. For Bergson, understanding this is liberating. It invites us to live time not as a succession of separate moments, but as a dynamic continuity in which the past merges with the present, where memory is less about recollection and more about the invention of the self. In the end, remembering is more about feeling than knowing. And in that feeling, what remains of the past is not the fact, but the emotion, the void we fill with meaning, even knowing that reality, as it was, can never be touched again. Nagarjuna, one of the greatest philosophers of Mahayana Buddhism, invites us to see reality as without essence, without fixity, without solid ground. For him, everything that exists arises in relation to other things. Nothing has its own independent, isolated, or permanent existence. This view is the heart of his philosophy, emptiness, shunyata. But what is emptiness for Nagarjuna? It's not nothingness as in absolute absence. It's not the collapse of reality, but its deep structure. To say everything is empty is to say everything is dependent. Nothing exists on its own. A cup, for example, is only a cup because there are hands to hold it, eyes to see it, materials to form it, words to name it. Remove its relationships, and it disappears. Emptiness, then, is not a denial of reality, but a way of seeing its relational nature. Phenomena do exist, but not as isolated entities. They are flows, encounters, interactions, and for that very reason, they are impermanent and without inherent essence. But Nagarjuna goes further. Even emptiness is empty. This means emptiness is not some new substance hidden behind things. It's not an ultimate truth that replaces all others. If it were, we'd fall into the same trap, turning emptiness into something fixed and therefore not empty. Nagarjuna's genius lies in showing that even negation must be negated. The teaching of emptiness is meant to dissolve conceptual attachments, including attachment to the teaching itself. It is a tool for liberation, not a doctrine to worship. This view has profound implications. If everything is empty, including the self, then there's nothing to protect with desperate intensity, no essence to defend, no pride to inflate, no suffering to make eternal. Understanding emptiness breaks the illusion of the separate self and opens the door to a life of compassion and lightness, because all beings like us are interdependent flows of causes and conditions. In the end, Nagarjuna offers us a living paradox. Emptiness is not the end of everything. It is freedom in everything. And in that freedom, being and non-being dance together, without center, without edges, without prison. Two of the earliest thinkers in Western philosophy stand in a tension that has never fully dissolved. Parmenides, with his radical affirmation of the immobility of being, and Heraclitus, with his celebration of ceaseless change, place us before a deep existential question. What is real? What remains? Or what changes? Parmenides believed that being is one, eternal and unchanging. Everything that changes is an illusion. Multiplicity, birth, death, movement, these are just deceptive appearances of the senses. For him, only pure thought can grasp true being, unmoving, complete, without beginning or end. To accept change would be to accept non-being. And for Parmenides, non-being is unthinkable. Heraclitus, on the other hand, saw movement as the very essence of the real. Nothing is fixed. Everything flows, everything changes, everything transforms. The river is never the same, nor is the one who looks at it. For him, being exists in becoming, a harmony of opposites in constant tension. The world is not made of permanence, but of conflict, and it is precisely that tension that creates balance. Between these two visions lies a conceptual abyss, a philosophical void. Parmenides rejects change. Heraclitus mistrusts permanence. Reality seems split between what never moves and what never stops moving. And we, as conscious beings, live inside that tension. This void between being and flow is not an absence, but a kind of dynamic interval, a field of instability where thought wavers and human experience unfolds. Life is not only movement, nor only being, it is the friction between the two. It is the constant attempt to hold on to what slips away, to understand the eternal with eyes that change at every moment. Perhaps the void, here, is precisely this space between irreconcilable opposites, where reality reveals itself as paradox. We don't choose between Parmenides and Heraclitus. We live between them. And in that between, in that silent fracture where being and flow meet without resolution, we feel the void, not as a lack, but as a creative tension. David Benatar is one of the leading contemporary defenders of antinatalism. The idea that bringing someone into the world is not a gift, but a sentence. For him, human existence, no matter how many moments of pleasure it may contain, is inevitably marked by suffering, loss, and death. And for that reason, not being born is better than being born. His argument rests on a simple yet unsettling ethical asymmetry. The absence of pain is good, even if no one experiences it. But the absence of pleasure is not bad, if there's no one to be deprived of it. In other words, if someone is never born, they never suffer, and that's good. And not experiencing pleasure because you don't exist isn't bad, because there's no subject to miss it. Therefore, not creating someone is always morally preferable to creating them. Benatar doesn't claim that everyone's life is an unbroken hell. He acknowledges that there are good moments, joys, and achievements. But he argues that these moments don't outweigh the inevitable pain of aging, frustration, loss, illness, and ultimately, death. And worse, most people, if they were honest, would not choose to relive their own lives from the beginning. This view isn't driven by hatred of life, but by radical compassion. For Benatar, avoiding suffering is a supreme value. And since living is, by definition, to suffer to some degree, the most ethical choice would be to avoid creating new conscious beings who will inevitably face pain. Of course, this perspective is shocking. It goes against the mainstream celebration of life, the hope, and the idea that being born is a gift. But its purpose is to destabilize certainties and force us to reflect. Do we value life for what it truly is, or only out of tradition, habit, and unexamined belief? Benatar reminds us that the good is not always in creating. Sometimes it is in sparing, and that perhaps the greatest harm is not death itself, but the painful road that leads us there without us ever asking to begin it. For Laozi, the universe didn't arise from matter, effort, or a divine will in the Western sense. It was born from the void, a silent space, full of potential, where nothing is fixed and everything is possible. This void is not absence, it is origin. From non-being, everything that is comes into being. In the Tao Te Ching, Laozi writes, "From non-being comes being, from being all things." In other words, the void, the invisible, unspeakable, limitless Tao, is the matrix of the cosmos. Before form, there was the formless. Before existence, there was the fertile silence of nothingness. But this nothing is not the same as the Western idea of the void, often thought of as lack or deficiency. In Taoism, the void is the source of creation, the space where movement begins, where water can flow, where breath can happen. Laozi illustrates this with simple yet profound images. The usefulness of a wheel lies in its empty center. The function of a house depends on the empty spaces between its walls. A jar is only useful because it is hollow. What is absent makes possible the use of what is present. The Tao, therefore, does not impose itself. It does not shout, dominate, or interfere. It simply is. It flows like water, seeking the lowest places without resistance. And it is precisely because it doesn't display itself, because it doesn't cling to any form, that it sustains everything. The void does not need to be filled. It already contains everything in potential. To live in harmony with the Tao is to embrace the void, not in the sense of giving up on life, but of stopping the fight against its flow. It is to let go of the urge to control, define, and possess. It is to understand that wisdom isn't in naming everything, but in inhabiting the silence between words. As Laozi says, "Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know." The void is not the end, it is the beginning. From it come time, nature, cycles, and all beings. Those who understand the void do not run from it, they bow before it. Because there lies the origin of the real, the simple, the eternal. Krishnamurti was a thinker who rejected all authority, traditions, and systems, including spiritual ones. For him, truth cannot be taught because it is not a formula, a belief, or a technique. It can only be perceived directly in the silence of a mind that has freed itself from the need for control. Control, for Krishnamurti, is the root of all conflict. The human mind constantly tries to dominate thoughts, emotions, impulses, and experiences, creating a division between the me who wants to control and the me who needs to be controlled. But this division is an illusion. The effort to control is, in fact, the denial of being. It turns life into a battlefield where every moment must be corrected, shaped, and repressed. At its core, this impulse to control comes from fear. Fear of chaos, the unknown, the void. The mind feels safe when it's in charge, even if that keeps it trapped. But that safety is false. Control doesn't create freedom. It creates tension, rigidity, and suffering. Krishnamurti points out that true freedom is only possible when we stop trying to control life, others, and ourselves. When we let the moment be what it is, without filters, without judgment, without the urge to change it. This total surrender to the now is a leap into the void, because the now cannot be possessed. It slips through our hands, always new, always uncertain, and precisely because of that, it's the only place where being can bloom. Surrender here doesn't mean passivity, it means full attention, a mind that observes without interfering, so present that the separation between observer and observed dissolves. In that state, the self, the mental structure built to control, disappears. What remains is simply what is, only the real. And the real is silent, vast, empty of form, yet full of life. Krishnamurti offers no techniques, no methods, no promises. He simply invites, look now, without running away, without wanting to change, without trying to become someone. Because in the end, to control is to kill the flow, and to truly live is to die to control, and be born into the emptiness of the moment. For Michel Foucault, what we call the self, that conscious, individual, sovereign I, is not a universal essence, but a historical construction. It's an invention of modern Western thought, shaped by knowledge, discourse, and institutions. The modern subject, the one who imagines themselves at the center of the world, hasn't always existed. It emerged with humanism, with the idea that man is the measure of all things, alongside the rise of psychology, sociology, medicine, and education. In other words, the I is a product of knowledge, but every historical construction is subject to time. And the modern subject, as valued as it is like a face drawn in the sand at the edge of the sea, beautiful, complex, but destined to disappear. Foucault foresaw a new era, not the end of humanity as a species, but the end of the subject as the center of knowledge. It will be replaced by something still unnamed, a new configuration of knowledge, perhaps forms of subjectivity that are more scattered, more fluid, less self-centered. This idea can feel unsettling. After all, we're used to thinking of ourselves as the core of experience, the owners of our story and our truth. But Foucault invites us to dismantle that illusion, to see that what we call the self is shaped by historical forces, languages, norms, and institutions. The subject does not speak for itself. It is spoken by the discourses that create it. And in this process of deconstruction, something surprising emerges. Truth is not found in fixing the self, but in letting it fade. Thought becomes freer when it's no longer bound to the demand for a solid identity. Freedom, then, is not in affirming the self, but in surpassing it. It's letting the mark in the sand be washed away by the waves, not with despair, but with lightness. Foucault invites us to think beyond the subject, to recognize that truth doesn't lie in a fixed center, but in the margins, in movement, in silence. And perhaps, by accepting the impermanence of the self, we can finally touch something more real and more free. For Dogen, founder of the Soto Zen school in Japan, meditation is not a means to achieve something, it is awakening itself. But what awakens, paradoxically, is not a more enlightened, elevated, or purified self. On the contrary, it's a self that dissolves. In the practice of Zazen, seated meditation in absolute silence, there is no goal, no achievement, no desire. Just being, breathing, observing, letting things pass. In this state of radical presence, the self, which we work so hard to protect, feed, and affirm, begins to lose its edges. Dogen tells us that to meditate is to rehearse death. Not biological death, but the death of a fixed identity. The death of the mind that clings to the past, the future, and its own ideas of itself. When we sit in Zazen, we die to our roles, to compulsive thoughts, to judgments. And we are reborn in the present moment. Each breath is a burial, each silence, a new beginning. This rehearsal of death is not dark, it's liberating, because it's precisely when the self goes quiet that real life begins to speak. When we stop trying to be something, to control the experience, to search for meaning, the present moment reveals itself in its silent fullness. For Dogen, time is not linear, it is the living instant, the eternal now. And in that now, there's no separation between life and death, between beginning and end. There is only being. Meditation, then, is letting go of everything, even the idea of meditating. It is dying to everything that is not now. This surrender takes courage, because there are no guarantees, no promises. Zazen is a leap into the void, but it's a fertile void, where you don't find the self, but life exactly as it is. No masks, no walls, no explanations. Dogen reminds us that awakening is not rising, it is disappearing. And that peace is not in having control, but in dying a little with each moment, and allowing the moment to live us. In Heidegger's view, death is not just the biological end of life, it's far more than a future event. Above all, it's the fundamental structure of human existence. We are beings who know we will die, and it's this awareness, this silent, constant foreknowledge, that shapes everything we are. Heidegger calls this being toward death, Sein zum Tod. It's not about a morbid obsession, but about radical clarity. To live, according to him, is to always be on the way toward death. And to deny this truth, to hide from it, to ignore it, is to lose the chance to live authentically. Most people, he says, live in a state of falling, distracted, alienated, immersed in routines, social conventions, and the false promise of permanence. They run from death, and in doing so, they run from themselves. But death doesn't wait until the end to show itself. It's the silent horizon that follows every decision, every loss, every change. It's the certainty that gives life its urgency. To recognize yourself as a being toward death is to awaken to authenticity. It's to let go of the illusion of infinite time and start living with depth and responsibility. Because when you look at life from the perspective of its end, everything changes in value. The trivial fades, the essential stands out. Heidegger doesn't suggest resignation, but presence. Death calls us to live not just any way, but fully, deliberately, intentionally. It shows us that our existence is not something given. It's a project we choose at every moment. This anticipation of death doesn't paralyze us. It frees us. It tears away the veil of distractions and puts us face to face with what matters: who we are, who we want to be, and what we're doing with the time we have left. Dying, after all, is the only guaranteed destination. But living as a being toward death is the chance to turn that destiny into awareness, and that awareness into freedom. Because only those who accept death as part of themselves can truly choose how to live. For Sartre, human existence carries within it a fundamental paradox. We are consciousness, and therefore we are emptiness. Unlike the things in the world, which simply are what they are, a rock is a rock, a tree is a tree. Human beings have no ready-made essence. We are what we are not yet, what we project, what we choose to become. This structural emptiness at the core of our being is what Sartre calls the nausea of being. On some deep level, we feel that something is always missing, and it's exactly this lack that drives us to act, to desire, to build, to create. We throw ourselves into projects, identities, roles, relationships, trying to fill what can never truly be filled. Sartre doesn't soften this drama. To him, we are the end trying to exist. We try to give shape to ourselves, like someone chasing a horizon that keeps moving further away. Every choice we make aims to create a meaning that will never be complete. And yet, we keep trying. Because that's what it means to be human. There is no essence before existence. We weren't designed by a deity, nor do we possess a fixed nature. Sartre is clear. Existence precedes essence. This means there is no true self waiting to be discovered. What exists is a self being built in time, through choices, through falls, through failures. Here, emptiness stops being a punishment and becomes freedom. The lack we feel doesn't have to be denied or hidden. It's the engine of creation, action, and responsibility. We are condemned to freedom, as Sartre says, because we have nowhere to hide. We can't blame fate, God, or biology for what we are. Every gesture is an act of invention in the face of nothingness. In this way, the human project is tragic, but also immense. We try to fill the void with meaning, even knowing that meaning is fragile. And in that attempt, always unfinished, we become who we are. Because in the end, to be is to lack, and to exist is to try, despite everything, to give shape to what will never be complete. For Plotinus, the Neoplatonic thinker of the 3rd century, the ultimate reality is not the visible world, nor the mind that thinks, nor the soul that feels. Before all of that, there is the One, absolute, indivisible, silent. The One has no form, no attributes, and cannot be defined or even conceived. It is pure fullness, so complete that nothing is missing. And for that reason, it doesn't need to act. It simply is. Everything emanates from the One, not by choice or will, but by overflowing. Like light radiating from the sun or heat escaping from fire, the cosmos emerges as a distant echo of this absolute presence. But before this echo, there is silence. For Plotinus, silence is not absence. It is absolute potential. It is the state where no distinctions exist yet. There is no time, no duality, no separation between subject and object. In this primordial silence, everything is contained, but nothing is yet expressed. It is the emptiness before the word, the stillness before sound, the space where being rests in unity with itself. Creation, then, does not begin with a shout or an explosion, but with a whisper of being emerging from silence. The world, the soul, the intellect, the forms, all these levels of reality gradually drift away from the One, gaining complexity, movement, and noise. And the farther they drift, the more they lose sight of the origin. The spiritual path for Plotinus is the return. The soul seeking wisdom should not chase more words, more explanations, more desires, but turn inward towards silence. Deep contemplation is the way to reconnect with the One, not through reasoning, but through the direct experience of a presence that is beyond both being and thought. In this sense, emptiness is not the negation of reality, but its purest origin. The cosmos is beautiful, yes, but it carries within it the memory of the silence that gave birth to it, and only when we quiet the noise of the mind can we hear that silence and remember where we came from. Few Western mystics were as bold as Meister Eckhart. A theologian, preacher, and philosopher of the 14th century, he broke through the limits of traditional theology by claiming that God can only be found in nothingness. But not in nothingness as absence, rather as formless fullness, where every image, concept, and desire has been abandoned. Eckhart believed that the human soul is, in its essence, a divine spark, but one covered in layers: will, thoughts, attachments, fears, and even ideas about God itself. Yes, even sacred images can become barriers, because when we try to grasp God with the mind, we end up creating a mental idol, a God in our own image. That's why, for him, the soul's path is not about accumulating devotion or knowledge, but about emptying itself of everything, wanting nothing, knowing nothing, being nothing. This is the core of negative mysticism. Only when the soul lets go of everything that is not God, including what it thinks God is, can it be filled with the true presence. To let God in, Eckhart said, you must step out. The paradox is profound. To find God is to lose everything, including yourself. This emptying is a kind of inner death. It is letting go of every support, every fixed idea, every comforting image. It is a leap into the dark, a radical surrender. But according to Eckhart, it is in this nothingness that God dwells. Because God is not in any form, any idea, any limited place. He is being beyond being, pure, silent, infinite. This experience is not achieved through effort, but happens when the soul stops striving, when it no longer tries to control, understand, or deserve. It is there, in that total surrender, that the birth of God in the soul takes place, not as something coming from outside, but as what has always been within, waiting for the necessary emptiness to appear. True union with the divine for Eckhart doesn't happen in fullness, but in emptiness. It's not knowing more about God, it's becoming nothing, so that only God remains. According to Plotinus, the highest point of reality is not the world, nor the soul, nor even the intellect. Above all of this is the One, the origin of all things, the silent source of existence. But the One is not just another being among beings. It is beyond being. And for that reason, paradoxically, it appears as emptiness. This emptiness, however, is not absence. It is pure fullness. The One is so simple, so complete in itself, that it needs no form, no attributes, no distinctions. It does not think, act, or desire. It simply is. Or rather, it is beyond being, which makes it inaccessible to language, concepts, or definitions. The simplicity of the One is so absolute that in its presence, everything composite seems distant and fragile. Every multiplicity, every difference, every movement, no matter how grand, is only a pale echo of this boundless unity. The One does not move, yet all movement flows from it. It does not think, yet it is the very condition that makes all thought possible. And here lies the paradox. Because the One is everything, it overflows. Without intention, without need, without will, it radiates. And from that radiation comes intellect, then soul, and finally the cosmos. The visible world, then, is the farthest echo of this origin. a faint reflection of divine simplicity. This overflow is not creation in the Judeo-Christian sense. For Plotinus, it is an inevitable emanation, like light streaming from the sun. Nothing is taken from the one. Everything flows from it naturally, as an effortless spilling over of fullness. The spiritual path, then, is not about adding more knowledge, more identity, or more forms. On the contrary, it is about returning to simplicity, shedding layers, quieting noise, descending the steps of being until reaching what lies before all things, the one that seems like nothing, yet is everything. The emptiness we feel when contemplating this reality is not lack. It is the impression that infinity leaves on us, because the one, in its absolute simplicity, does not shout. It is silent, and in that silence, it overflows with the fullness we call existence. For Nagarjuna, reality has no fixed core, no permanent essence, no absolute foundation. Everything that exists does so in relation to something else, and for that reason, nothing exists on its own. This is the doctrine of emptiness, shunyata, not as a denial of the world, but as a deep understanding that the world is interdependent, fluid, and impermanent. Emptiness, then, is not the collapse of reality, but its truest structure. What we call real is conditioned. It arises, changes, and disappears. And because of this, trusting in what is conditioned, fixed ideas, solid identities, possessions, status, means placing faith in something that will inevitably pass. Trusting in emptiness, on the other hand, means accepting the truth. Everything changes. Nothing lasts. Nothing stays the same. And far from being hopeless, this can be liberating. Nagarjuna is not asking us to reject the world, but to see through it, to realize that forms, thoughts, and feelings are momentary, and that suffering comes when we try to make them permanent. When we understand that everything conditioned will pass, we also see that attachment, pride, and fear are all based on illusions. Emptiness, in this sense, is not the absence of reality, it's the absence of illusion. By trusting in emptiness, we learn to let go, to release, to live lightly. We understand that what comes, goes, what is born, dies, what forms, dissolves. But we also see that within this constant flow lies compassion, connection, and the possibility of transformation. Nagarjuna says that even the teaching of emptiness is empty. It is not an absolute truth to be worshipped, but a tool for freeing the mind. Wisdom means holding on to nothing, not even the idea of wisdom itself. To trust in emptiness is to embrace reality as it is, impermanent, interconnected, and free. And in that trust, we find the only certainty that remains: nothing lasts, and that's what makes us truly alive. Exploring emptiness, endings, and the deepest ideas about existence isn't an easy path, but it's an act of courage. And if you've made it through all 50 of these lessons, that already says a lot about your inner search. I hope these ideas have challenged you, moved you, maybe even unsettled you, as all living philosophy should. Because thinking is also a kind of emptiness, a space between what we know and what we're still capable of seeing. If this content resonated with you in any way, hit the like button. It really helps spread this message. Share it with someone you know who's also thirsty for depth, and leave a comment. Which of these philosophies spoke to you the most? Which one challenged you? And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next philosophical deep dives. This journey is only just beginning. Here, we'll keep digging into thought, being, time, and mystery. Stay tuned. There's much more ahead. Maybe not answers, but even more essential questions. Because in the end, philosophy is the eternal return to what never truly ends. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.